my basic job was really to kind of set up liaison between his operation, the production group.
He was the one who got there first, before the ambulance, before the panic spread past the gates. Dick Grob, Elvis Presley's longtime chief of security, stood in that house on the worst morning of his life. Decades later, the question still follows him. Could he have done something sooner? Could anyone? Vernon Presley himself once asked Grob to find out the truth. What he uncovered, and what he still carries, has never fully left him. Today we go inside that morning, through the eyes of the man who was actually there, the cop who brought lemonade.
I talked with him that morning from between about 4 in the morning till about 4:30, just before he went down and played racquetball.
May the 1st, 1967, Palm Springs, California. A police officer sat in a patrol car outside a private estate, sweating through his uniform. No air conditioning, just heat, boredom, and a job nobody wanted that week. His name was Dick Grob. His assignment was simple: keep the fans and the press away from a newly married couple honeymooning inside the walls. Elvis Presley and Priscilla Presley had just been married days earlier in Las Vegas. Now they wanted privacy, and the Palm Springs Police Department had sent officers to make sure they got it. Grob did not expect what happened next. A man walked out of the house holding a glass of lemonade. He crossed the lawn, opened the patrol car door, and handed it through the window. "Here," he said. "Looks like you need this?" It was Elvis Presley, standing in his own driveway, handing a drink to a cop baking in a car with no air conditioning. The two men talked for nearly an hour that afternoon. Grob remembered it clearly even decades later. They sat by the radio, listening to dispatch calls, trading stories. Nothing about fame, nothing about music, just two men killing time on a hot day. Before Grob left his shift, Presley told him something that would change the trajectory of his life entirely. "Come on in anytime you want more to drink." It sounds like a small moment, a passing kindness between strangers, but it became the foundation of a relationship that would last a decade, one built first on trust, then on responsibility, then on something closer to family. Over the following months, Grob continued working security details whenever Presley was in town. The friendship deepened gradually, the way real ones tend to. Presley noticed something in Grob that mattered to him specifically: discipline, calm under pressure, a police officer's instinct for reading a room and spotting danger before it became visible to everyone else. By the early 1970s, that instinct had a new home. Presley brought Grob in formally, eventually naming him chief of his security operation. The job description sounded simple on paper: protect Elvis Presley. In practice, it meant something far larger: managing a small army of bodyguards, coordinating with local police departments in every city on tour, screening visitors at Graceland, handling threats that range from overly enthusiastic fans to genuine, credible danger. Grob took the responsibility seriously, in a way that set him apart from some others inside the circle. He had been a real police officer. He understood procedure, documentation, and the value of taking a threat seriously before it escalated into something irreversible. This mattered more than most people realized at the time. By the mid-1970s, the job had expanded well beyond simple physical security. Grob found himself managing logistics for entire tours, coordinating travel, hotel security, venue access, and emergency planning for crowds that sometimes numbered in the tens of thousands. He worked closely with Presley's father, Vernon, who handled much of the business side of operations at Graceland. This closeness with Vernon would matter enormously later, though neither man could have known it yet. Inside the walls of Graceland, Grob occupied an unusual position. Not quite family, but trusted with family-level access. Not quite staff, but responsible for decisions that affected every person living and working inside those gates. He saw things other members of the inner circle did not always see, partly because his role required him to notice patterns, irregularities, anything that deviated from normal. By 1976, those patterns had started shifting in ways that worried him. Grob never spoke publicly in detail about exactly when his concern began, but those close to him later described a slow, creeping unease that built over roughly 2 years before Presley's death. Security details that once felt routine started feeling different. Medical deliveries to the house increased in frequency. The energy inside Graceland, once defined by music and constant movement, began to feel heavier, quieter, more closed off from the outside world. He kept doing his job, screening visitors, managing threats, coordinating tour security with the same discipline he had brought to the role for years. But underneath the routine, something had changed. And Grob, trained to notice exactly this kind of shift, could not unsee it once he noticed it. The lemonade on that hot afternoon in 1967 had led him somewhere he never expected, into the inner circle of the most famous performer alive, into a role of genuine trust and responsibility, eventually into a position that would place him closer to the final, devastating morning of August 16, 1977, than almost anyone else alive. He did not know it yet, sitting in that patrol car years earlier. But the road from that small kindness to that terrible morning had already begun. The house that became quiet. By the start of 1976, Dick Grob noticed something he could not easily explain to anyone outside the gates. Graceland had changed, not the house itself. The walls still stood the same. The grounds still stretched the same way they always had, manicured and guarded. What had changed was the rhythm inside it. Fewer late-night jam sessions in the music room. Longer stretches of silence from the upstairs bedroom, where Presley spent more and more of his time. A staff that moved differently through the halls, careful, almost cautious. In ways Grob had not seen in his earlier years working there, his role required him to track patterns most people never thought to track: deliveries, visitors, and anything irregular. By that year, the irregularities had started piling up in ways that concerned him professionally, not just personally. Medical deliveries to the house increased in frequency. Grob, with his law enforcement background, understood exactly what certain prescriptions meant when they arrived in the volumes he was seeing. He was not a doctor. He had no authority to question medical decisions made by Presley's physician. He had spent years reading Rooms for Danger, and what he saw inside that house started reading less like routine medical care and more like something he recognized from a different context entirely. He kept his concerns largely to himself, at least early on. His job was security, not medicine. Overstepping into Presley's personal health decisions risked the trust that had taken nearly a decade to build. But trust, Grob later acknowledged in limited public comments, came with its own quiet cost. Watching something happen and feeling unable to intervene meaningfully. July of 1976 brought a moment that reshaped the entire inner circle. Red West, Sonny West, and Dave Hebler, three of the longest-serving bodyguards, were fired in a single phone call. Grob remained. So did a small handful of others considered essential to daily operations. The firing sent a clear message throughout the remaining staff. Voicing concern too loudly carried real consequences, regardless of how long someone had served. Grob adjusted accordingly. He continued doing his job with the same professionalism he always had, but he became more careful about which concerns he raised and to whom. By early 1977, word had reached the house that the three fired bodyguards were writing a book. Grob, like everyone else inside Graceland, watched the tension around that news build for months. Presley's mood shifted unpredictably during this period. Long stretches of isolation, followed by sudden bursts of activity. Planning tour dates, recording sessions, business meetings that seemed designed to prove, perhaps to himself as much as anyone else, that nothing had really changed. Grob's responsibilities expanded that year in ways that placed him even closer to Presley's daily routine. Tour security required constant coordination, and increasingly, that coordination meant adjusting plans around Presley's unpredictable health. Shows shortened without warning, schedules rearranged at the last minute. Grob managed these logistics quietly, protecting the public image of a performer whose private reality looked increasingly fragile. Those closest to Presley during this final stretch noticed Grob's particular value. Unlike some others in the circle, he rarely raised his voice or pushed back directly. He worked within the system as it existed, adjusting wherever possible, protecting wherever he could, without confronting the deeper problem head-on. This approach kept him inside the circle of trust. It also meant he carried concerns he never fully voiced, concerns that would resurface decades later in ways he likely never anticipated. By the summer of 1977, the house had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Tours continued, performances continued, drawing the same massive crowds they always had. But the man Grob had known since that hot afternoon in Palm Springs a decade earlier had changed in ways that worried him more than he let on to almost anyone. He noticed Presley moving more slowly through his own home. He noticed conversations that drifted toward fear and suspicion more often than they used to. He noticed, most concerning of all, a growing isolation, even from people who had stood beside him for years. Grob continued his work, screening visitors, managing security details, coordinating the logistics of a life that still looked, from the outside, exactly like superstardom. From the inside, increasingly, it looked like something closer to survival. August arrived with another tour scheduled to begin in just days. Preparations moved forward as they always had, despite the underlying tension that had built steadily for nearly 2 years. Grob handled logistics for the upcoming departure the same way he handled every detail of every tour, methodically, carefully, without drawing unnecessary attention to concerns he could not fully act on. Nobody inside that house, including Grob himself, fully grasped how close they were to the end. The patterns he had been quietly tracking for nearly 2 years were about to converge into a single morning that would define the rest of his life. That morning was less than 2 weeks away. The morning everything stopped. August the 16th, 1977. Early afternoon. The phone calls inside Graceland started arriving faster than anyone could process them. Dick Grob was on the grounds that day, handling final logistics for the tour, set to begin within 48 hours. Flight arrangements, security coordination for Portland, Maine, the first stop on the schedule. Routine work, the kind he had done hundreds of times before. Then the routine stopped. Word reached him quickly once Ginger Alden found Presley unresponsive in the upstairs bathroom. Staff scrambled through the house, voices raised. The careful, controlled atmosphere Grob had spent a decade helping maintain collapsing within minutes. Joe Esposito had already begun resuscitation efforts on the bathroom floor by the time the full scale of the emergency became clear to everyone else inside the house. Grob's training kicked in immediately, even as the personal weight of what was happening pressed down on him. He had spent years managing chaos, coordinating with police departments, controlling crowds, securing venues under pressure. None of that training had prepared him for this particular morning, but the instincts held regardless. Someone needed to manage the scene. Someone needed to handle the practical details nobody else could think clearly enough to handle. Paramedics arrived within minutes. Moving through gates Grob himself had spent years securing against outsiders, now waved through as fast as humanly possible. The ambulance ride to Baptist Memorial Hospital felt, to those present, both impossibly long and impossibly fast at the same time. Vernon Presley's reaction in the hallway outside the bedroom became one of the defining images of that morning for everyone who witnessed it. A father told his only child was likely gone, collapsing against the wall, repeating his son's name, as though saying it enough times might somehow undo what had already happened. Grob, alongside a small handful of others, found himself managing the unmanageable. Press inquiries were already starting, even before official word had been confirmed. Fans were already gathering outside the gates, drawn by rumors spreading faster than any official statement could contain them. Security, his entire professional purpose for the past decade, suddenly needed to serve a purpose nobody had trained for. Protecting a dying man's privacy in his final, most vulnerable hour, then protecting a family's grief in the hours immediately following. At 2:30 that afternoon, Elvis Presley was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital. He was 42 years old. The hours that followed blurred together for everyone inside that circle, Grob included. Practical decisions needed to be made immediately, even as the people making them struggled to process what had just happened. Funeral arrangements, security for an unprecedented crowd already swelling outside Graceland's gates, coordination with Memphis police, who anticipated correctly that the city was about to experience something it had never managed before. Grob's specific role that day placed him closer to the operational reality of Presley's death than almost anyone else in the inner circle. He was not in the bathroom when Ginger found him. He was not among the very first people in the room, but he was close enough, present early enough, involved in the immediate aftermath thoroughly enough that the question would follow him for the rest of his life. Could something have been done sooner? This was not a question Grob invented for himself decades later. It was a question that began forming within hours of that afternoon as he replayed the morning's timeline against everything he knew about Presley's health, his medication routine, and the warning signs that had been quietly accumulating for nearly 2 years. He thought about the medical deliveries he had tracked without fully understanding their implications. He thought about the moments he had noticed Presley moving more slowly, sleeping less predictably, isolating more completely from the people who cared about him. He thought about his own position inside that house, trusted, present, observant by training and instinct, and yet somehow not positioned to prevent what had just happened. These thoughts did not resolve quickly. They did not resolve in many ways for years. In the immediate aftermath, there was no time for that kind of reflection. The funeral needed managing. Thousands of mourners needed controlling outside gates Grob had secured for a decade, now overwhelmed by a scale of public grief nobody had fully anticipated. Grob worked through those days on instinct and training, pushing the deeper questions aside simply because there was no space yet to address them. Vernon Presley, in the weeks following his son's death, approached Grob with a request that would shape the rest of Grob's relationship with that final morning. He wanted answers, not comfort, not reassurance. He wanted to know, specifically and honestly, whether his son could have been saved, and if so, what exactly had gone wrong. Grob agreed to look into it. He did not yet know that this investigation would consume years of his life, reshape his understanding of everything he had witnessed during those final 2 years, and leave him carrying a question that, even decades later, he would never fully resolve. That investigation began almost immediately. What Vernon asked him to find. In the weeks after his son's funeral, Vernon Presley called Dick Grob into a quiet room at Graceland. The request he made that day was simple in its wording and enormous in its weight. Find out what really happened. Vernon did not want comfort. He had buried his only child, and platitudes about fate or timing were not going to satisfy a father who had personally watched the warning signs accumulate for nearly 2 years. He wanted facts. He wanted someone with investigative training, someone who already understood the household's inner workings, to look honestly at the final months and determine whether anything could have changed the outcome. Grob was uniquely positioned for this task, a former police officer, a decade of intimate access to the household, years of practice tracking patterns, irregularities, and risks most people inside that circle never thought to document. Vernon trusted him precisely because Grob had spent years proving himself trustworthy in exactly this kind of work. The investigation that followed took Grob back through records, conversations, and timelines he had lived through, but never fully assembled into one continuous picture. Medical deliveries he had tracked without understanding their full implications. Schedule changes he had managed without asking why they kept happening. Conversations with staff who had noticed things, small things, that nobody had connected into a larger pattern while Presley was still alive. Piece by piece, a more complete picture began forming. Grob spoke with members of the medical staff who had treated Presley during his hospital stays in 1975. He reviewed what he could of the prescribing patterns that had drawn scrutiny even before the death. Patterns that would later become central to Dr. Nicopoulos's 1981 trial. He talked to staff members who had been present during the final weeks, comparing their recollections against his own observations from that period. The central question Vernon had posed never fully resolved into a clean answer. Could earlier intervention have changed the outcome? Grob's own later reflections on this question, shared in limited public comments over the years, focused less on blame and more on timing. The real question, as he came to frame it, was not whether Presley could have been saved in some abstract sense. It was whether help, called earlier, on that specific morning, might have changed what happened in those final hours. This distinction mattered enormously to Grob personally. It shifted the weight of the question away from the broader, more paralyzing issue of years of accumulated health decline, and towards something narrower, more specific, and in some ways, more painful. A matter of minutes and hours on one particular morning, rather than an unsolvable puzzle stretching back years. The investigation continued for an extended period after Presley's death, eventually informing a book Grob would write decades later, The Elvis Conspiracy, published in 1996. The title suggested something more sensational than the actual content delivered. Grob was not chasing theories about foul play or hidden enemies. he was chasing a far more uncomfortable possibility. That ordinary human delay, ordinary hesitation, ordinary uncertainty about what was actually happening behind a closed bathroom door may have cost precious time that morning. This was a harder truth to sit with than any conspiracy theory could have offered. A conspiracy implies an external force, something beyond anyone's control. What Grob's investigation pointed toward instead was something closer to home. A household full of people who loved Presley deeply, who had grown accustomed to long stretches of silence from behind closed doors, who did not immediately recognize that this particular morning's silence was different from all the others that had come before it. Vernon Presley received Grob's findings with the same quiet intensity he had carried into that first conversation requesting the investigation. There was no public statement following Grob's work, no dramatic revelation delivered to the press. Vernon, by all accounts from those close to him during this period, simply absorbed what Grob found and carried it privately for the remainder of his own life, which ended in 1979, less than 2 years after his son's death. Grob continued working at Graceland through 1980, eventually transitioning into a different career entirely, engineering and installing safety systems for a major company before later returning to live in Las Vegas. The investigation he had conducted for Vernon stayed with him through every subsequent chapter of his life, resurfacing in interviews, in his eventual book, and in the quiet moments he later described when reflecting on that final August morning. He never claimed to have found a definitive answer. He never claimed certainty about whether faster action that specific morning would have changed the outcome. What he offered instead, decades later, was something more honest and more difficult. A genuine, unresolved question that he had spent real time and real effort trying to answer, without ever reaching the clean resolution Vernon had originally hoped for. That uncertainty, more than any specific finding, became the lasting legacy of the investigation Vernon Presley requested in the weeks following his son's death. It was a question Grob would carry for the rest of his own life, and it was a question that, decades later, he finally found himself willing to discuss openly in his own words for the first time. The question he never put down. Decades after that August morning, Dick Grob finally spoke about it at length, in his own words, for the first time in real detail. By then, he was in his late 60s, living in Las Vegas, far removed from the daily rhythm of Graceland that had once defined nearly 15 years of his life. The distance of time had not softened the question he had carried since 1977. If anything, it had sharpened it. He framed the question the same way he always had, the same way he had framed it for Vernon Presley decades earlier, not whether Presley could have been saved in some broad, unanswerable sense. Something narrower, something he could actually hold and examine. Could he have been alive today? Grob asked aloud in one of his rare detailed interviews, if people had done certain things differently that specific morning. This phrasing mattered to him. It was not about years of accumulated health decline, the kind no single morning could have reversed. It was about minutes, hesitation, and the gap between discovering something was wrong and recognizing how wrong it actually was. Grob walked through the morning's timeline again in these later interviews, the same timeline he had reconstructed for Vernon decades earlier. Ginger Alden waking in the early afternoon. The silence from the bathroom that had, in earlier months, sometimes stretched for hours without concern, because that pattern had become normal inside that house by 1977, the moment she finally opened the door. The chaos that followed within seconds. He never assigned blame directly to any single person in these accounts, not to Ginger, who discovered him, not to Joe Esposito, who began resuscitation efforts immediately upon arriving, not to the household staff, who reacted as fast as anyone reasonably could once the emergency became clear. His focus stayed instead on the pattern that had developed over the preceding 2 years, a pattern that had quietly trained everyone inside that house, himself included, to treat long silences as ordinary rather than alarming. This, he suggested in later reflections, was the real tragedy hiding inside the more specific question of timing. Not a single failure on one particular morning, but a slow erosion of urgency that had built up gradually, invisibly, until it became simply how life worked inside those walls. Grob spoke about his own position inside that erosion, with a kind of honesty that surprised some who had followed his career for years. He had been trained throughout his entire law enforcement background to treat irregularities seriously, to escalate concerns before they became emergencies. Yet, inside Graceland, across nearly a decade, he had watched his own instincts dull slightly, adjusting gradually to a household where irregularity had quietly become the baseline. He did not describe this as a failure of character. He described it, more precisely, as a slow adaptation that nobody inside that environment fully recognized while it was happening. The same adaptation, he suggested, that likely affected everyone close to Presley during those final 2 years, regardless of their individual training or instincts. This reframing did not resolve the original question Vernon had asked him to answer. If anything, it complicated it further. If the entire household had gradually adapted to treating serious warning signs as routine, then no single moment of hesitation on that final morning could fully explain what happened. The explanation stretched back much further, into a pattern Grob himself had quietly tracked for nearly 2 years without ever fully confronting its cumulative weight. He carried this complexity into his later public reflections with noticeable discomfort, even decades removed from the events themselves. Interviewers who spoke with him during this period described a man still visibly affected by a question he had never fully resolved, despite having spent real, sustained effort trying to answer it honestly for Vernon all those years earlier. What made his account particularly affecting, according to those who heard it directly, was the absence of any attempt to protect his own role in the story. He did not minimize his proximity to the final warning. He did not distance himself from the patterns he had failed to fully escalate during those final 2 years. He simply described, as honestly as he could manage, what he had seen, what he had missed, and what he still wondered about, even after decades of reflection. This honesty came at a personal cost that those close to him recognized clearly. Revisiting that morning repeatedly, across interviews and his own written reflections, meant reliving a version of grief that had never fully resolved into acceptance. Some who knew him during this later period described someone who seemed to genuinely need to keep examining the question, not for public benefit, but for some private sense of resolution that always remained just out of reach. He never found that resolution completely. He said as much himself, directly, in his most candid later reflections. The question Vernon Presley had asked him to answer in 1977 remained in its essence unanswered. What had changed across the decades between that request and his later reflections was Grob's willingness to sit inside that unresolved space publicly, rather than offering the kind of clean, comfortable answer that might have satisfied audiences looking for closure. He offered something more difficult instead, a genuine lasting uncertainty carried honestly by one of the last people who had actually been there. What his account changed.
He also had a very long history of insomnia, and he took his sleeping pills, but again, these were all prescribed to him by a medical doctor.
Dick Grob's reflections, gathered across decades of limited but candid interviews, shifted how serious researchers and longtime fans understand the final August morning. For years, public understanding of Presley's death rested almost entirely on the original press conference and the toxicology debates that followed. Grob's account added something different, a first-hand, ground-level view of how warning signs accumulate quietly inside a household until they stop registering as warnings at all. This mattered specifically because Grob was not a distant observer. He was trained in law enforcement. He had spent years professionally trained to notice exactly the kinds of irregularities that built up around Presley during his final 2 years. His own admission that even his instincts had gradually adjusted to treat those irregularities as routine offered researchers something more valuable than blame. It offered insight into how easily even trained, caring people can lose sight of a slow-moving crisis happening directly in front of them. His 1996 book, The Elvis Conspiracy, landed differently than its title suggested. Readers expecting a sensational story about hidden enemies or foul play found something far more restrained. A security chief's methodical account of dates, deliveries, and decisions, laid out with the same procedural discipline Grob had brought to the job for a decade. Reviewers at the time noted the book's unusual tone for its genre, less interested in scandal than in sequence. The careful, almost forensic reconstruction of a household sliding slowly toward catastrophe. Addiction specialists and medical historians studying the broader case have since referenced accounts like Grob's specifically, alongside the toxicology and prescription records, to build a fuller picture of how isolated decisions and gradual normalization combine to produce outcomes that look, from the outside, sudden and unexpected. Grob's particular contribution was procedural rather than medical. He could not explain the chemistry of what happened inside Presley's body. He could explain, in granular detail, exactly how a house full of people who loved someone deeply could still fail to recognize the moment that finally mattered. For Vernon Presley, the answer Grob eventually brought back never offered the clean resolution he had originally hoped for in 1977. Those who knew Vernon during his final 2 years described a man who absorbed the findings quietly, without public comment, carrying them the same private way he had carried most of his grief. He died in 1979, reportedly still revisiting the same questions he had first posed to Grob, according to people close to the family during that period. For Grob himself, the question never fully closed. He carried it through a career change, leaving Graceland in 1980 to work installing safety systems for a Fortune 500 company, a profession built almost entirely around preventing exactly the kind of overlooked risk he had lived through personally. Colleagues from that later career, interviewed decades afterward, recalled him as meticulous to an unusual degree, someone who seemed to take small irregularities more seriously than most people in his field. None of them knew, at the time, where that instinct had come from. He eventually returned to Las Vegas, the city he had worked in years earlier, alongside fellow bodyguard Sam Thompson, the two men Presley had once nicknamed his bookends. Their friendship continued long after Graceland closed its gates to them both. Two men who had occupied very different corners of the same impossible job, bound by an experience few others alive could fully understand. Grob's willingness, late in life, to discuss that final morning candidly gave the public something rare. Not a tidy conclusion, but an honest accounting from someone who had genuinely been there. He gave interviews sparingly, choosing his moments with the same caution he had once applied to screening visitors at Graceland's gates. When he did speak, those who listened closely noticed the same restraint that had defined his book years earlier. No dramatics, no effort to cast himself as a hero or a victim. Just a careful, measured account from a man still working through something that had never fully settled. That restraint is, in its own way, what makes his story land harder than a more theatrical account might have. There was no dramatic confession, no single shocking revelation. There was only a slow, honest unspooling of memory, offered by someone who had spent decades trying to answer a question his own training told him he should have been able to answer cleanly, and never quite could. Researchers who later studied his contributions alongside the broader medical and legal record described his account as a missing piece that finally connected the human side of the story to the clinical one. The prescriptions, the toxicology, the courtroom testimony from 1981 all explained what had happened to Presley's body. Grob's account explained something different: how an entire household of people who cared deeply could still, collectively, miss the moment that mattered most. That honesty is, in many ways, the most lasting part of his story. Dick Grob never found the clean answer Vernon Presley asked him to find. What he found instead was harder to carry, a pattern, building quietly for years, that nobody inside those walls recognized in time. If this story moved you, subscribe for more honest accounts from the people who were actually there.